And I think it's gonna be a long time. Whoa. Nourish my soul. Music and laughter. Fucking those three, man. Love. Connection. God. Oh. Release.
I have not recorded in a few days, or at least I haven't recorded one of these reflections. How was this weekend? Well, I took Sunday off. Saturday was, I don't know, typical day. I was outside for a few hours. Just continuing to connect, play the game. Yeah, the last few days have been really a lot about love, a lot about loving myself more, letting more love in, just opening my heart more. On Sunday, I talked to Mel, my previous partner, and I had been sitting with this weekend in some ways. The part of me that's terrified, that terror that came up week one, terrified of death, suffering, being rejected, being not enough, being unworthy, all of that. Terrified that there's some part of myself that I've hidden away so much that I actually don't even know it. And I was slowly feeling that because as I've been in this process longer, there is a sense of this deep terror that it's time to face it, or it's time to meet it and go through the process of processing it. And so, yeah, talking to her brought some of that up because it was a little alive. And we just went through the process of talking about, if shit hits the fan in a real way, what does that look like? What does it look like to potentially not just need support, because we talked about lining up my support system, talking to them, making sure they're okay to be called if I'm not doing well. But like, what is the worst case scenario? And for me, it's not a suicide. It's not something like that. This doesn't feel suicidal. This feels like, this could break me mentally, like psychotic break type of thing, which isn't a fun thought. Right? It's quite terrible and scary. It's scary. I know a lot of people that have had trips to a psych ward or a mental slip, or several of them. And it's not something I necessarily judge. Like most people I know that have gone, if they've done enough work around it, it's actually been a really powerful experience for them. But it's still like that thought of losing a sense of myself enough, like that's scary. That's scary. So we kind of went through the steps of what does that look like? Who do I call? Which was a little sobering, but also just good to have some stuff teed up. And then Sunday I was off, and I went up and watched a movie with my mom and my brother, and it was the greatest beer run ever. And the long story short in the movie, it's very kind of heartfelt. Guy has got a great heart. Goes over to Vietnam during the war to bring a few of his buddies beer to tell them that he supports them. But in the process winds up seeing the war up close and personal, and it affects his perspective on the war and on pain and suffering. And so that was triggering to me. It wound up bringing me into contact with this depth of terror around pain and everything that I mentioned, which also brought me into contact with a deep sorrow and a deep sense of, as I have been over the years, expanding my capacity for empathy and my capacity for compassion, and developing through stages of either spiritual development or egoic development. Both of those have to do with broadening one's identity in a sense of, I no longer have a deep sense of care for myself or just for my family or just for my friends, but for others, for a larger group, for humanity as a whole, for animals, for the earth, so on and so forth. And so the broader that I can have a deep sense of connection and compassion and empathy for, the more I have grown, and I can see more of life from different perspectives because I can embody their perspectives more and their feelings and their sensations. But one of the things that has come along with that for me is embodying their pain and suffering to an extent, right? Obviously, there's a large extent I can't do that. But yesterday, no, this was Sunday, after watching that movie, and I was already in a place, this deep sorrow came over me of, I'm sorry. Not looking out the world and saying, we're so fucked, what have we done to ourselves? But looking out the world and saying, what have I done to us? Right? Whether I've directly done something terrible, quote unquote, or not, as Harry, can I look out at the world and take a level of ownership? Can I look out at the world and truly feel that on some level, I've done this? I have, in some ways, gotten so lost in ignorance or in avoidance or whatever, that there has become a deep level of suffering. And again, I'm not saying it's because of me, but on some level, I am. On some level, I look around, and Thich Nhat Hanh, a monk, Buddhist Zen monk, wrote tons of books, has a poem where he talks about looking at the world and all of the different people and the predators as well as the prey, the beautiful as well as the ugly, and just goes through all these different scenarios, and it's quite raw and intense, so I'm not going to quote it, and then he says, and I'm all of them. I am the predator that preys on people, and I'm the person being preyed on. I am the person taking advantage and the person being taken advantage of. And when I read it, it's not coming from a sense of, oh yeah, that's a good concept to be able to practice compassion. It feels like he's owning something and in true contact with something that is really hard to get real about. To look at humanity and see myself, to look at humanity and truly feel as close and as responsible for as I would my own child, as I would my own family, as I would myself. And long story short, I broke down. I just cried and cried and cried. And I was folding clothes and I was crying. I was like, I don't know why I'm folding, but I just have to. And I was crying. And it was a really, really big release. A really, really big, sorrowful, true, sincere, I'm sorry. Is it all worth it? Is the juice worth the squeeze? Have what we've done to ourselves, is that worth surviving for? Is survival for survival's sake worth it? And I think on a very primal, organismic level, our organism is unless overridden by higher awareness, will always choose survival. And I get that. And it makes sense because we still exist. But on another level, it's like, man, look at what we've done to ourselves. Is it worth existing an extra 1,000 years if it's done in a way that where we lose our humanity, where we lose something, where we become something maybe lesser, or we become something that we wouldn't strive to want to be, to want to become. And that's an easy contemplation, but the reality of like, what am I actually saying here is different. But just that pain and the sorrow of that came through really strong on Sunday. Yeah, so this weekend was a lot of things, but mostly that was the big event, the big release. Cried, was on the floor, was walking around, was doing laundry, was crying on during all of it. And it felt like a cry that I'd held in for a long time. Because, and this is what I'll finish with, is it feels like it came through because I was finally able to feel into this deep terror and sadness inside of myself for the first time, potentially ever, but maybe just since I was a child when it first got stuck in there. And so the more that I come into contact with that, the more that naturally seems to bring up a deep empathy for the world and for people and animals and the earth. And me as those things as me. It was beautiful. It was painful, but it was beautiful.